In this video we're going to introduce you to the concept of relative prices and how the price mechanism allocates resources based on this idea of relative prices in a competitive market. So the price mechanism, and we've looked at this before, it refers to the manner in which changes in relative prices influenced by changes in demand and supply determine how resources, land, labour, capital and entrepreneurial resources are allocated among competing users. Okay, so the price mechanism is how demand and supply, and you need to be able to define all of this, how demand and supply determine relative prices, which determine how resources, scarce resources, are allocated amongst competing users. That's what the price mechanism is all about. And we know that self-interested producers will shift resources into areas where they're going to get the highest profits, and higher prices act as price signals to shift resources into these areas. Relative prices is a critical concept, and all relative prices means is the price of one good or service measured in terms of the price of another good or service. So we're not talking about the actual or the accounting price, so the actual dollar term that you pay. We're looking at the price relative to other goods and services. And it is relative prices that determine the incentives of consumers and producers, and it is relative prices that determine what goods and services are produced. Because producers are interested in where they're going to generate the highest profits, and that's all based on what the relative prices are of different goods and services. So what I mean by relative prices is, well, if we look at the price of milk in this example, it was at $2 last year, and so this should say 2015, and this might say 2016, I should have written that. But the price of milk from 2015 to 2016 has stayed at $2. Okay, its actual price hasn't changed, or its accounting price hasn't changed. But what's happened to its relative price? Well, compared to bread, its relative price has decreased. The relative price of milk is now lower relative to bread. So self-interested producers may be willing to shift more resources into bread now because it's generating a higher price. But it does depend on what's caused that higher price. What about the relative price of milk compared to potato chips? Well, even though the price of milk is considerably less than potato chips, its relative price has increased compared to last year. Okay, it's now half the price of potato chips, where last year it was just over a quarter of the price, or 2/7 of the price of potato chips. So even though its actual price hasn't changed, the relative price of milk relative to potato chips has increased, and the relative price of milk compared to bread has decreased. If we're comparing bread and potato chips, well, the relative price of bread has increased significantly compared to potato chips over the last year. Okay, last year it was only half the price, or not even half the price. This year it's over 100% of the price, or a higher price. So the relative price of bread has increased relative to potato chips. What are some factors that can cause a change in relative prices in competitive markets? All of these factors can cause a change in relative prices, and it's all the kind of things we looked at when we looked at demand and supply. So taxes can change relative prices. If we put a tax on something, its relative price will increase. If fashion tastes can change relative prices, so things come into fashion, they get a higher demand and their price goes up. Supply side conditions, natural disasters, advertising can change relative prices. Changes in age distribution, so what I mean by that is certain products, so for example, again looking at older people, the prices of products that older people are more likely to buy are going to increase if there is an increase in an ageing population, so that can affect relative prices. Climatic conditions, natural disasters, floods can affect relative price of agricultural products. Government assistance, subsidies, so if we provide subsidies to certain industries, their relative price will fall. And tariffs and restrictions on trade with other countries can also affect relative prices. So if we put a tariff on, for example, PlayStations coming in from Japan, then their relative price will increase. The reason I've put three of these things in pink is that if you get asked a question, name something that will change the relative price in a competitive market, we're talking about a market without government intervention. You can't talk about number 1, 7 or 8. You can't talk about any ways that the government influenced the market. So if you get asked, name one thing that's going to change relative prices in a competitive market, you might say, well, fashion tastes are going to change relative prices in a competitive market. If something goes into fashion, that's going to cause a shortage of the product, that will cause a higher relative price as demand shifts to the right, and therefore resources will be allocated more to those areas. So choose one of numbers 2 to 6 if you get asked a question on what's changing relative prices in a competitive market. Alright, this is the key slide. Relative prices compare the market price of different products or resources. Relative profits compare profits gained from producing one particular good or service from those producing other goods and services. Self-interested producers are going to shift resources into areas where they can generate the highest relative profit. Okay? and that will generally be associated with higher prices, but not always. And that's what we're going to look at in the next slide. So self-interested producers, acting in their own self-interest, are going to shift resources into areas with the highest relative profits, not always relative prices. Those producing goods and services that are in the highest demand will become more profitable and gain higher incomes. So we're going to shift resources to areas where there's higher demand, but it's all based on relative profits. So what I mean by that, and this is the last slide for this video, okay, demand's influence on relative price and resource allocation. If something has a higher relative price because of a shift in demand to the right, we're going to shift more resources to that area because it's going to be more profitable. So if something becomes into fashion, or it's bathing suits and we're approaching summer, anything that's causing a higher relative price because of more demand is going to see resources shift to that area. If something has a lower relative price because of a lack of demand, resources are going to be shifted away from that area. It is no longer as profitable to shift resources into that industry. So demand's the easy bit. If it's higher demand, there's going to be a higher price and resources will go to that area. If there's lower demand, there will be a lower price and resources will shift out of that area. Supply is the harder one. Okay? If higher relative prices are caused by higher production costs, so if they're caused by a tax, or they're caused by unfavourable supply side conditions, or if they're caused by a tariff on a product, or something that's causing, or higher labour costs in that industry, or higher cost of capital in that industry, something that's causing the supply curve to shift to the left, that's going to cause a reduction in profit. They're only charging a higher price because their costs of production are higher. And that's going to lead to resources being shifted out of that industry. So if the higher relative price is caused by higher costs of production, resources will shift out of that industry because they'll be less profitable. So that's why resources don't always shift to areas with the higher relative price. If something gets a lower relative price because of a supply side factor, so say technology improves or productivity improves, or we have favourable supply side conditions, that's going to be an incentive to shift resources into that area because it is more profitable. So if we have a really good harvest and we're producing grapes, for example, that's going to cause a lower relative price, but we're still going to shift resources into that area because it's more profitable. It's only a lower price because it's much lower cost of production. If we subsidise a certain industry, that's going to cause a lower relative price, but again, production costs are so much cheaper that resources will be shifted into that industry. So be careful about what's causing the change in the relative price. Businesses only care about changes in relative profits. In the next video, we're going to have a look at some questions and how to answer them. Some tough